The Texas sun glared across the camp yard, stretching the shadows of barbed wire like claws across the sand. She stood in line with the others, sweat tracing down her spine, her uniform still stitched with imperial crests, now meaningless in defeat. Then came him, a broad-shouldered soldier with a hat too large and an accent too slow, whistling as he tossed hay to the horses behind the compound fence. "Y'all ever been kissed by a cowboy?" he asked, not crude, not mocking, just curious. His voice wasn't leering. It was playful, easy, ridiculous, and yet something in her gut twisted. The woman beside her bit down hard on her laugh, but she couldn't. She bit her lip instead, hard, because in that moment, between war and absurdity, she remembered how long it had been since anyone had spoken to her like she was more than a body in a uniform. It was wrong, it was shameful, and it was human. The bus wheezed to a halt on the edge of what looked more like a ranch than a prison. Dust spiraled around the tires. A hawk circled overhead. The women inside the bus pressed their foreheads to the glass, sweat clinging to their necks, uniforms stiff with salt and dirt. A sign read, "Camp Huntsville." Beyond it, wooden barracks stretched beneath a ceiling of open sky. There were no screams, no snarling dogs, no officers with leather sticks. Just quiet. Too quiet. One woman murmured that it must be a trick, that death was quieter than war. The door creaked open. No one moved at first. Then a name was called, mispronounced with an American drawl. Another and another. They stepped out slowly, like ghosts. The Texas sun struck them full in the face, dry, blinding, alive. Heat pulsed from the ground. A few American guards stood nearby, rifles slung low like afterthoughts. One chewed a toothpick. Another held a clipboard and a jug of water. It wasn't what the women had imagined, not even close. The imperial training camps had drilled it into them from day one. Surrender was disgrace. Death was honor. A woman captured was already defiled, her life no longer her own. Their instructors, all male, had painted vivid pictures of what awaited them in enemy hands: violation, starvation, public stripping. One officer had spat the word American like it was rot. "You would beg for the rope," he had said once, "before they are done with you." She had believed it. They all had. And so, when the gates opened to this, silence, blue sky, a mess hall that smelled faintly of coffee and horses, their bodies went still, but their minds screamed. They were marched in single file, boots crunching on gravel. There was barbed wire, yes, coiled at the corners, glinting like old silver. Guard towers stood at lazy attention. But the buildings themselves were painted, their windows clean. Laundry flapped on a line behind the barracks. Someone, somewhere, was playing a radio softly. A man's voice crooning about love and lost time. Inside the intake tent, they were told to sit. A soldier handed out slips of paper with serial numbers. Another poured iced tea into tin cups and passed them down the line. The first woman took hers with shaking hands and stared into the cup as if it might explode. The next took a sip and winced, not from bitterness, but from memory. Cold, sweet, unbelievable. Then came the blankets, soft, laundered, folded. A pile of them sat on a wooden bench, and each woman was handed one. She gripped hers tightly, fingers clenching the cotton like it might vanish. It was the first object she'd received since capture that wasn't rationed, cursed, or stained with mud. There was no barking of orders, no humiliation, just names read from a list, a guard trying, and failing, to pronounce them, and the rustle of fabric as they were guided toward the barracks. The women walked stiffly, trained eyes, searching for punishment hidden in every corner. But it never came. Later that night, as they lay in bunks with springs that creaked and sheets that smelled faintly of lemon soap, one of the women whispered to the ceiling, "Is this America?" Another replied, "It has to be a dream." But dreams did not carry the scent of hay and tobacco or the sound of distant laughter from a guard playing cards outside the mess. She wrapped the blanket tighter, staring into the wooden ceiling slats. Her body was here, but her mind was still on a battlefield, where mercy meant deception and comfort was the bait of wolves. And yet her lips still throbbed from earlier, from the moment she'd bitten down to keep from smiling. What happens when your enemies give you everything your commanders never did? You start to watch them, not with fear, but with a terrible kind of curiosity. It began the morning he strolled past the barracks with a piece of straw between his teeth, hat tilted low, a pair of dusty boots tapping rhythm on the gravel. He looked like a storybook caricature, something from an American film they were told never to trust. And yet, there he was, real, tall, wide-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun, not by war. He didn't look at them like prisoners. He didn't avoid their eyes. He nodded, smiled even, like it was any other day in any other place. They learned his name through whispers, Private Henry Talbot from Abilene, Texas. But the women simply called him the Cowboy. His duties were vague. Sometimes he delivered rations, sometimes he tended the horses in the back fields, sometimes he stood watch near the recreation area. But wherever he was, the air around him felt different, less guarded, less stiff. He hummed tunes under his breath, slow, mournful country melodies with no words. One day he passed by the fence with a radio under his arm and whistled out, "Y'all ever hear Hank Williams? Man's voice could melt snow." The women blinked, unsure if it was a threat, a joke, or both. Then came the first story. He was unloading hay behind the stables when one woman, sweeping nearby, dropped her broom and flinched. He didn't bark. He didn't glare. He crouched, picked it up, and said with a shrug, "Don't worry, ma'am. I've dropped heavier things, like my Uncle Roy at the state fair after 6 beers. A few women nearby glanced up, startled. One smiled before she caught herself. She turned away, cheeks burning. This was not how enemies behaved. This was not the cruelty they'd trained for. This was worse. It was normal. She began to study him, not out of attraction, or so she told herself, but because he was dangerous in a way she couldn't explain. His presence chipped at her composure. His lack of hostility disarmed her more than any rifle. And when he offered her a peach one afternoon, soft, ripe, its skin sun-warm from his hand, she hesitated too long. He just grinned. "Suit yourself," he said, and bit into it with theatrical delight. Juice ran down his chin. She hated that her stomach growled, hated more that she almost laughed. That night she lay awake thinking about his voice. Slow, drawling, filled with pauses. Not sharp like the officers back home. Not filled with judgment, just easy. Was it flirtation? Was it disrespect? She didn't know. In her world, a woman was not seen unless she had failed. Her value was in silence, obedience, utility. She had patched wounds, carried stretchers, buried bodies. And here was a man who asked if she liked horses. She didn't know how to answer. The women began whispering about him, about the way he spoke, the way he walked, the strange songs he played on a rusted harmonica. He was a disruption, not because he was vulgar, but because he wasn't. When he said things like, "My mama used to sing in the kitchen when she was sad," they didn't know whether to be touched or offended. Some thought he was mocking them. Others thought he was just simple. She wasn't sure. All she knew was that he made her feel seen in a way that was far more terrifying than being invisible. Her shame grew louder with every joke he cracked, every kind word that didn't land like a slap, because deep inside, a crack had started. Something old and rigid inside her was giving way, and she feared what might grow in its place. Back in Japan, flirtation was either a weapon or a warning. Here, it was undefined. She didn't know the rules. She didn't even know the game. She only knew that when the cowboy tipped his hat one afternoon and called her ma'am, her knees didn't buckle from weakness. They buckled from confusion. And when she turned away, it wasn't out of disgust. It was because she didn't trust the look on her own face. The next morning, a guard handed her a small bar of soap. No words, just an open palm, a nod, and a square of ivory wrapped in paper. She stared at it like it was a joke. But it wasn't. It was real, heavy in her hand, clean, fragrant, almost floral. Her fingers closed around it slowly, unsure whether to hide it or hold it up to the sky. She hadn't felt clean in months, not truly. Not since the jungle, not since the retreat. Not since the bodies began to pile higher than rations. The showers were lined in dull tile, their drains rusted from time and use, but the water that poured down was hot, scalding even. At first she flinched. Then she stood motionless as steam curled around her face, lifting away the layers of dried sweat, blood, and humiliation. The soap foamed easily, sliding down her arms like silk, and then, without warning, her legs gave out. She sat hard on the wet floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and sobbed. It was silent at first, then louder, guttural, embarrassing. She didn't cry when her friend was shot next to her, didn't cry when she was slapped for losing a morphine vial. But here, naked, warm, bathed by the enemy's plumbing, she cried until her body shook. Later, back in her bunk, she couldn't explain why. She told the others she slipped. She made a joke about the heat. No one asked further. But that night she lay wrapped in her blanket, fingers still smelling faintly of lavender, and thought about the soap. How absurd, how treasonous, to feel gratitude for such a thing. The next day she was assigned to the stables. She assumed it was punishment, some quiet American joke. But when she arrived, the cowboy was already there, whistling, brushing a chestnut mare with long, patient strokes. He didn't speak at first, just nodded. Then he handed her the brush. "Start at the neck," he said, voice low. "Long strokes, not short. Makes 'em twitchy." The brush was wooden, worn smooth with use. The horse flicked an ear but didn't move as she approached. She raised her hand slowly and let the brush touch the animal's coat. The warmth stunned her. The softness. She hadn't touched anything living without tension in nearly a year. Not since the jungle, where every rustle meant ambush. Not since her brother. She hadn't thought of him in weeks. Bled out in her lap, shaking as she pressed cloth to his stomach. The horse shifted its weight and exhaled. And just like in the shower, her composure cracked. Not into sobs this time. Just silence. Just shaking hands. Just 1,000 memories crashing into her ribs all at once. She kept brushing. She didn't speak. Neither did the cowboy. But when she turned her face away, it wasn't to hide tears. It was to keep from saying thank you. Kindness, she realized, was its own kind of weapon. It didn't strike. It didn't command. It just existed, relentlessly, insidiously. The soap, the food, the warm bed, the brush in her hand. It all chipped away at the story she'd been given, that Americans were savages, that mercy was weakness, that capture meant erasure. Instead, here was a man who gave her reins and space, who watched her cry without trying to fix it, who let her feel. She couldn't tell if it was a trick or a truth, but she knew it hurt more than any slap could. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They were clean. Her fingernails were trimmed. There was no blood beneath them, no dirt, only skin. And under the skin, something else, something breaking, something blooming, and it terrified her. The pencil trembled slightly in her grip. The paper, thinner than she liked, curled at the corners from humidity and the nervous pressure of her hand. She sat at the small wooden table inside the camp's writing room, a plain space with 3 chairs and a box of dull pencils, flanked by a bulletin board with rules in both English and Japanese. "Letters may be monitored," it read. She already knew that, but it didn't matter. The danger wasn't in what she might say. It was in what she couldn't. She began with the same 3 words every woman did. "Mother, I'm alive." She paused. That alone was already a betrayal. She had been trained never to fall into enemy hands. To live after capture was shame. To admit it in ink, even worse. But the sentence stayed. Next, "I am in an American camp." She hesitated. "We are treated decently." She almost scratched it out. She almost wrote adequately or as expected. But the truth pressed against her chest like a stone. So she left it. She added nothing about the showers, nothing about the music, nothing about the warm food, or the strange way the guards called each other "sir" without bark or threat. She said nothing of the cowboy. Instead, she ended the letter with the one phrase she knew her mother might understand without details. "I think of you every morning when I wake up and remember I am still breathing." The letter was folded, placed in a pouch, and collected by a quiet corporal who spoke enough Japanese to nod respectfully. She watched him leave the room and felt her stomach twist, not because he would read it, but because someone in Tokyo would. The Japanese Intelligence Division, still scrambling to keep a semblance of control over morale, had begun intercepting mail from POWs as early as the previous winter. What they found in these women's letters was troubling, not because the women were revealing secrets, they weren't, but because the tone had shifted. The terror was fading. Slowly, in between words like bread and rest, there was something else, a tone of gratitude, or worse, softness. They wanted letters filled with suffering, proof that the Americans were beasts, that surrender was a death sentence. Instead, they got lines like, "We eat 3 times a day," or "I am allowed to write," or worst of all, "I think I will survive." She didn't know how her mother would read the words, didn't know if the letter would even make it, but she imagined the old wooden floor of their home, the tattered kettle, her mother's worn slippers, her father's empty chair. Would the smell of horses and bacon seem real in a place where children were boiling weeds? And still, what she could not write was the most unbearable part of all, that she felt more dignity here, in the hands of her supposed enemy, than she ever had in the hands of her superiors. No officer had ever asked how she slept. No commander had ever called her "ma'am," even in mockery. The first time she saw her name, her real name, written in neat English on a roster, she stared at it for 5 minutes. Not a number, not a unit, just her name. The paradox was heavy. Back home, honor was starvation, silence, sacrifice. Here, it was a cup of water handed without scorn, a pencil given without demand, a brushstroke on a horse's neck. And yet she couldn't share any of it, not without betraying everything she had sworn to uphold, not without tearing her mother's heart open. So she ended with, "I am alive. I am safe. I do not understand this war anymore." She signed her name slowly, folded the page, and placed it in the outgoing tray. Then she sat still for a long time. Not because she feared punishment, but because for the first time she feared understanding. understanding that maybe the war had ended inside her long before the generals ever surrendered. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the camp yard as the women lined up with brushes in hand. Another afternoon of stable duty, the smell of hay, sweat, and leather mixed with something new, ease, laughter. One woman had learned to hum along with the Cowboys' harmonica. Another had braided her hair for the first time since capture. The war, at least for a moment, felt far away. That was when it happened. She was walking back toward the fence, boots dusty, arms flecked with strands of horsehair, when the cowboy passed by with his usual easy gait. He tipped his hat with a grin and drawled, "Look at you, like a wild mare just waiting to run." There was a pause, then light chuckles, a ripple of nervous amusement. Some of the women laughed too hard. Some glanced at her, then away. The cowboy didn't linger. He just kept walking, whistling low, unaware that he had thrown a match onto dry leaves. She didn't laugh. She didn't speak. She stood frozen, the breath locked in her ribs, eyes fixed on the ground. Her hands clenched around the brush until her knuckles went white. It wasn't the words themselves. It was what they echoed. Not captivity, not cruelty, but the suggestion of longing, the suggestion that somewhere inside her freedom still existed, that wildness could be recognized, named, teased. She turned sharply and walked toward the barracks, ignoring the stares. Inside, she sat on the edge of her cot, brushing her hands clean with an urgency that bordered on violence. The joke had been simple, harmless, but her mind wouldn't let it go. Was she being tamed? Turned into something soft, something domestic? Or was she being mocked, turned into a spectacle for a man who had the luxury of humor while she clung to survival? Or worse, was she being seen? That last question echoed the loudest. For so long, her life had been shaped by invisibility. In training, they were taught to erase themselves, to move like ghosts, to obey without voice, to die without name. During one of the first Bushido lectures, a commander had slammed his fist on a table and shouted, "A woman's smile is the first surrender." That had stuck with her. The idea that to show softness, humor, desire, any of it, was to betray the nation. She remembered the drills. Standing in perfect rows, sun burning down, mouths sealed shut while male officers shouted commands. Each time someone flinched, they were forced to run until their legs collapsed. Each time someone smiled, they were slapped. Not because they were weak, but because they had forgotten that war was not a place for beauty, not for women, and certainly not for freedom. So what did it mean now for a cowboy to look at her and speak as if she could still choose something? That there was still a door somewhere in her mind, a gate unlatched? She didn't want to feel flattered. She didn't want to feel anything. But she did. And that, more than the joke, was what stung, because it meant the war inside her was still raging. That no matter how many blankets they gave her, no matter how sweet the food or soft the horse's muzzle, she could not shut off the part of herself that remembered what she had lost, and what she might still want. That night, she lay awake listening to the low laughter of guards near the mess hall, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't think of her mother or the mountains of Japan. She thought of wild things, of running, of what it would mean to run toward something instead of away. And that thought, though brief, was more dangerous than any bullet ever fired. A week later, he handed her a trowel and pointed to a rectangle of earth near the fence. "Grow something," he said with a half-smile that tried not to look like kindness. She blinked. At first she thought it was a joke, some foreign punishment disguised as whimsy. But he was already walking away, tipping his hat toward the sky as if he'd handed out shovels 1,000 times before. The dirt was dry, reluctant, hardened from seasons of heat. She knelt down slowly, pressing her fingers into the soil. It crumbled beneath her nails, coarse and hot. A paper bag beside her held seeds. Zinnias, he'd said. She had never heard the name before. Bright things, he promised. Tough little suckers. She wasn't sure whether he meant the flowers or the people planting them. The fence loomed just a few feet away, its wires humming faintly in the Texas wind. Beyond it, a watchtower, tall and skeletal, watched her through a curtain of dust and heat. The irony twisted in her stomach. A prisoner, planting flowers under the eye of a rifle. She planted the seeds anyway. Each morning, before breakfast, she returned to the small plot. At first, there was only silence. No green, no hope. But her hands remembered the movements, not from gardens, but from triage. Wrapping bandages, administering morphine, digging trenches for the bodies they couldn't carry. That memory came back sharp one morning when the wind shifted and brought with it the faint smell of antiseptic from the camp infirmary. She knelt over the soil and remembered another man's face. Sunken, gray, too young to die but too far gone to live. She'd held his hand as he slipped away, her fingers stained with blood, not dirt. Now her fingers were covered in soil, not sorrow. And that, too, felt wrong. She found herself speaking to the seeds without realizing it. Not in full words, just murmurs, breath. She wasn't sure who she was talking to, the flowers, the ghosts, or herself. Each day the dirt softened. Tiny green shoots began to break the surface. She stared at them like they were traitors. What business did beauty have in a place meant for erasure? Around her, the other women noticed. A few asked to help. Others scoffed. One muttered, "You're giving them what they want, smiling flowers for their newspaper." But she didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she didn't know what she believed anymore. One afternoon, as she watered the bed, a shadow crossed the garden. She looked up. The cowboy stood there, arms crossed, watching. "Didn't think you'd take to it," he said. She said nothing, just wiped her hands on her skirt. He stepped closer and added, softer this time, "You got a good touch. Things like to grow for you." That night, she couldn't sleep, not from guilt, not from fear, but from something else. A question. Could one act of creation erase 1,000 acts of survival? Could a flower undo a wound? The gun tower never stopped watching. Every time she crouched in the dirt, it loomed above, its barrel still, but always present, a reminder that no matter how deep she planted the seeds, there was still steel above her, still a war, still a line she could not cross. But the flowers kept coming. Red, yellow, white, blooming defiantly against the wire. And she, kneeling in the sun, no longer knew whether she was defying her past or mourning it. That night, the camp was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel like peace, but something older, heavier, the sound of waiting. Most of the women had already gone to bed, the barracks dim with the low hum of insects and distant murmurs. She sat alone near the window, cooling her wrists with a damp cloth, when it came. Soft at first, barely a thread of sound, a slow, aching tune from the far side of the yard, the harmonica. She froze, not because it surprised her. She'd heard him play before. But never like this. This wasn't the cowboy's midday whistle or his lazy porch tunes. This was something private, bare. The melody was low and wandering, not heroic, not bright. It bent in strange, minor places, notes that stretched out like a question too ashamed to ask itself aloud. She pressed closer to the window, careful not to let the bunk creak. He was sitting alone on the stoop of the tool shed, hat off, elbows on his knees, staring into the dark. There was no audience, no women nearby, no officers, just him, his breath, and that mournful silver mouthpiece turning sorrow into sound. She didn't know the song, but she knew its shape. It reminded her of the temple bells back home, the ones that echoed through the mountains during mourning ceremonies. Not the loud clang of grief, but the soft chime of remembering. She listened with a strange ache blooming in her ribs, not for the cowboy, but for the absurdity of it all. A prison guard playing music not for control, not for morale, not for command, but for himself. In her world, music had always meant purpose. It came from above, barked through loudspeakers or tapped out in tempo during drills. It told you when to move, when to salute, when to disappear. You didn't feel it. You obeyed it. But this was music without duty, sound without a reason. She didn't know whether to feel jealous or guilty. She lay down, facing the wall, eyes open, listening until the last note dissolved into silence. It didn't resolve. The melody just ended, cut off like a breath lost in sleep. The absence of applause, of recognition, made it feel even more real. And that's what disturbed her most, that it wasn't a performance, that he hadn't meant for anyone to hear, that it was honest. Later, when the moon had crept high and the camp had sunk into deeper stillness, she whispered, just a note at first, then two, quiet, careful. She didn't know the words. There were none. But she translated the shape of the melody into syllables her tongue remembered. Japanese. Not the sharp military bark, but the soft, round sounds of lullabies her mother used to hum while scrubbing rice. She barely recognized her own voice. It trembled, untrained, unused. She stopped, then tried again. A second line, fuller this time. The sound felt foreign coming from her mouth, not because of the language, but because it wasn't meant for anyone else. It was hers. When she finished, she lay back and pulled, the blanket to her chin, heart hammering for reasons she couldn't name. The shame came quick, as it always did, not for breaking rules, not for whispering songs in the dark, but for wanting to, for allowing herself, even for a moment, to believe that beauty could exist in a place built for erasure. Outside, the wind picked up and carried a final note from the harmonica across the fence, just one, faint and fragile. She closed her eyes. And for the first time, sleep came not as surrender, but as song. Morning carried a thin mist off the fields, curling around the stable like breath on glass. The horses snorted softly, their hooves shifting against packed earth. She moved through her routine almost without thought, filling buckets, brushing coats, feeling the familiar rasp of the straw under her palms. The world had settled into patterns again, fragile ones, breakable as glass, and she guarded them carefully. It was easier that way, to work, to breathe, to pretend the harmonica had never found its way into her ribs. He arrived later than usual, boots quieter, stride slower. No straw between his teeth, no whistle, just silence and a hat held lower than before. He nodded once, not smiling, and something in the air changed. She noticed the way his gaze kept dropping to the floor, as though searching for something lost between the boards. He picked up a brush, ran it once along a horse's flank, then stopped. The animal twitched, confused. He didn't apologize. "You ever talk to someone you were supposed to hate?" he asked suddenly. Her hand froze on the reins. The question hung there, not accusatory, not cruel, just naked. She didn't answer. She didn't trust the answer. He exhaled, a slow weight of breath. "My brother died over there," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the horizon, as if the Pacific were just past the fence. South of Okinawa. He was infantry, wrote me letters till the week before. He paused, then added quieter. He liked music, too. She felt the words hit deeper than she expected, like stones dropped into still water. I should hate you, he continued. Folks back home say I ought to. Man loses a brother. He's supposed to carry that anger like a medal. His voice cracked, just barely. But I don't, and I keep asking myself why. He gave a small, humorless smile. Ain't that improper? She looked away, and her lip began to tremble, not because of his loss, not because of her guilt, but because of the impossible space his honesty created, a space where neither of them were soldiers anymore, just two survivors standing in straw and silence, trying to understand why the war had spared them and taken so many others. Her teeth pressed gently into her bottom lip, not to hurt herself, just enough to hold something back, something unnamed, something that wanted to escape. He didn't step closer. He didn't reach for her. He just stood there, letting the air carry his confession as it pleased. That ocean, he went on, picked men off like seeds in a storm, never asked what side they were on. Her throat tightened. The stable smelled suddenly of salt instead of hay. She thought of her brother, too, of his blood warming her hands as his body went cold. She had never said his name here, had never spoken him aloud in this place, because to speak him would be to let him die all over again. You don't gotta say nothin', he said, noticing the struggle in her eyes. I just figured maybe pain don't belong to one flag at a time. That was when the collapse came, not loud, not visible, but complete. The world she had been taught, enemy and ally, victor and defeated, cracked like dried mud under her feet. Because his grief sounded too much like her own, because his loss didn't ask permission from flags, because his pain had no uniform. Who was the enemy now? The man who offered her seeds and soap? Or the voices from her past who taught her to hate what she had never known? He wiped his hands on a rag and looked up at her then. Not with expectation, not with pity, just with something like surrender, not to war, but to truth. I don't forgive you, he said. Ain't my place. Ain't your fault neither. But I ain't gonna carry hate I didn't earn. And in those words there was no blame, no absolution, only release. She had not asked for forgiveness, had not begged, not bowed her head, not sought mercy. And yet here it was, handed to her like the soap, offered without ceremony. A kindness too large to refuse, too heavy to understand. Her lip trembled again. She bit it harder this time, because if she spoke, she would weep, and if she wept, she would accept, and she didn't yet know if she was ready for that. And as she returned to brushing the horses, her hands no longer shaking, only one thought echoed inside her. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't hatred. It's being seen by the one you were told never to understand. If you are enjoying this story, give the video a like and drop a comment saying where you're watching from. We love hearing your stories. The days had grown warmer. The horizon now shimmered earlier in the morning, and the flowers in the prison garden, red, yellow, and white, bloomed without apology. The women whispered of repatriation. The word carried a strange weight, freedom wrapped in fear. Freedom, yes, but also return. And return meant questions. Return meant remembering how to forget. She stood by the trough rinsing her hands when she saw it. A reflection, not sharp like glass, but shimmering on the surface of a dented metal bucket. She leaned closer. The woman who stared back did not wear a uniform. Her cheeks were darker than they had been months ago, sunburnt and freckled. A loose strand of hair fell across her brow, longer now, no longer pressed and bound in the tight knots of military neatness. Her mouth, which had been a line of silence, now softened at the corners. Not a smile, but something waiting to become one. She wasn't sure who she was looking at. Not the nurse who'd wrapped wounds under gunfire. Not the ghost who had arrived in Texas with her head bowed and fists clenched. This was someone in between. Someone still becoming. The stable creaked as he walked in, the cowboy's steps familiar now. He didn't say much, just handed her something small, wrapped in cloth. "Figured you ought to have this," he said. She opened it slowly. A mirror, hand-sized, smooth-edged, with a tiny crack at one corner. Old, but whole. She stared into it. The same face she'd seen in the bucket, now clearer, more intimate. "Don't forget her," he added, eyes on the horses. "You earned her." No flourish, no explanation. He just turned and walked toward the fence line, hat low. She held the mirror tightly, more fragile than glass. What did it mean to keep a reflection, to carry home a version of herself that had only ever existed inside wire and sand? Later that afternoon, she brushed the horse one last time, the same chestnut mare she had once feared, the same animal that flinched from her in those first days. Now the horse leaned into her touch, breath warm and rhythmic. She moved slowly, her hands careful, reverent. Each stroke was a goodbye, but also a thank you, for stillness, for silence, for teaching her how not to be afraid of living things. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the horse's neck and listened to its heartbeat. Heavy, present, real. There was no ceremony, no farewell from guards, just a list read aloud, a transport truck idling outside. She would leave behind the garden, the stable, the dust that had woven itself into her skin, but she would take the mirror, and the scars no one could see. That night she sat on her bunk, staring at the stars through the crack in the window. She held the mirror in her lap, face barely visible in the dark. The melody from the harmonica floated faintly in her memory. Though he didn't play that evening. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe some songs are too sacred to repeat. When the call came, she stood and gathered her things, a folded blanket, a letter she never sent, the mirror. She looked one last time into the cracked glass, and for the first time didn't see a prisoner. The ship docked in Yokohama beneath a sky the color of wet cement. The wind carried the smell of salt, rust, and ash, and the harbor that had once been filled with bustle and banners now lay in silence, scattered with skeletons of boats and buildings. She stepped off the gangplank into a world she barely recognized. No one greeted them, no children waved, no banners welcomed them home. Just the sound of boots scraping against concrete and the heavy quiet of a nation still bleeding. The train to Tokyo groaned across cracked rails, lurching through villages that looked like shadows. Rooftops folded in on themselves, windows gaping like wounds. In place of soldiers or fanfare, she saw barefoot children chasing ghosts through the ruins and mothers boiling weeds over fire pits. The rhythm of the tracks hummed a sound she'd once known, but no longer trusted. Home. When she reached her street, she wasn't sure it was hers. Her childhood home stood crooked and half gone, a wall missing, the porch sagging with the weight of years. Her mother sat near a blackened stove, stirring something in a pot too thin to be soup. She looked older than memory allowed. Smaller, somehow, shrunken not just by time, but by hunger. They stared at each other in the doorway, silence falling between them like dust. And then her mother asked, "Is it true?" Her voice was brittle, a sound held too long. "Did they treat you well?" The words were simple. The question wasn't. She nodded, but said nothing more. Because how could she speak of soap when her mother smelled like smoke and rot? How could she describe the sound of a harmonica drifting across the Texas dusk, or a garden that bloomed behind barbed wire, to a woman who hadn't seen green in years? How could she explain the weight of kindness when it came from the hand of an enemy? The truth wasn't about bacon or cowboys. It wasn't about the warm meals, the brushes, the stable. It was about what she had become, in the most unlikely of places, and what that meant for the part of her that still wore a uniform, even when the fabric was gone. That night, she lay awake on a straw mat, the ceiling above her cracked and full of holes. Her brother, skeletal and asleep, murmured something in his dreams. Her mother didn't speak again. In her hand, she held the mirror the cowboy had given her. She didn't look into it, not yet. She just held it to remind herself that it was real, that it happened, that she had, for a time, been more than a prisoner, more than a soldier, more than shame. She wanted to tell them, to share the melody she hummed to herself at night, to show them the horse, the garden, the cotton clouds that drifted over the compound fence. But the words stayed sealed inside, because even now, in the ruins of war, she knew the danger of saying too much. The next morning she walked down to the stream where she and her brother once caught frogs. The water was low, the banks cracked and dry. She cupped it in her hands and washed her face. And then, slowly, she pulled out the mirror and looked. What stared back wasn't a traitor, and it wasn't a hero. It was just a woman, scarred, burned, awake. She thought of the stable, the soap, the way his voice softened when he wasn't trying to make her laugh. She remembered the weight of his words. "I should hate you," he had said, "but I don't. Ain't that improper?" And her lip had trembled, not from shame, but from something close to being understood. She walked back slowly, dust clinging to her feet. Her mother didn't ask again that day. But even if she had, she would have answered the same way. A nod, a silence. Because what she brought back with her wasn't a story. It was a scar that softened her hands, and a truth too complicated to explain. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the air felt heavy with memory, she would touch the mirror, or hum a tune only she remembered. And if no one was looking, just once, she might let the corner of her mouth lift into a smile that never quite arrived. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your voice.